I don't know who the hell he's talking about. Folks, you know, I think your physical constitution exceeds your mental acuity and judgment to sit here this long. Even in Ireland, having this many speakers and being the last speaker is a bit of a challenge. I want you to know before we begin, I will talk a little bit of Gaelic football. Mayo will win tomorrow. The curse is about to end, and I expect full credit when it does. My great-grandfather, Edward Francis Blewett, who was a mining engineer in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and the first Irish Catholic ever elected to the state senate in Pennsylvania in 1907, formed an organization when he was brought over by his father as a one-year-old in 1851, and he formed an organization. It was the largest Irish organization in the region called the Sons of Mayo. So he would come down and strike me dead if I did not support Mayo. I want you to know that. Secondly, I suffer from a similar problem as our last speaker, and that is that we have a thing called the Gridiron Dinner every year in Washington. It's a brutal, brutal dinner where about 600 press people show up, and they roast the president and or the vice president, whoever the speaker is that year, and we are supposed to stand up and be funny. And one of the best lines that the president ever used at the dinner was, "My name is Barack Obama. I'm learning to speak without a teleprompter. Vice President Biden's learning to speak with one." And my response was, "That's the Irish of it. That's the." I always am kidded by my colleagues for the last number of years in the United States Senate and as Vice President because I'm always quoting Irish poets. They think I always quote Irish poets because I'm Irish. I don't do that for that reason. I quote them simply because they're the best poets in the world. And one of my favorite, particularly modern Irish poets, was Seamus Heaney, and who just passed away not long ago. And he wrote a poem called The Cure at Troy. And in that poem, there's a stanza that has, my nephew is with me and my brother Jimmy is with me. They've heard me say this 1,000 times. But I think captures my sense of optimism about what's possible in the year 2017. Your children are going to see more change in science and technology in the next 10 years than have been seen in the last 50 years. You are going to be flying, if you live another 20 years, 20,000 miles an hour subsonically. You are going to be having your grandchildren vaccinated against multiple forms of cancer when they go in to get their shots for measles and mumps to go to school. You are going to see some amazing, amazing, amazing changes. And Heaney had a line in The Cure at Troy that I think best characterizes where we are today. And it goes like this. He said, "History teaches us not to hope on this side of the grave, but then once in a lifetime, that tidal wave of justice rises up and hope and history rhyme." And I can't be with any more prominent group of people who may be responsible for making hope and history rhyme than all of you in this room today. And I mean that sincerely. I allegedly am an expert on foreign policy. An expert's anyone from out of town with a briefcase. I do not have a briefcase with me. I have spent an awful lot of time allegedly being very knowledgeable about constitutional scholarship in my country, in the United States Senate. But I find I'm in awe of the intellectual capacity and the dedication of the people in this room and the literally thousands of researchers and oncologists we talked about, just speaking to 9,000 of them in Washington. Such an incredible group of people. And I think that we have reached an inflection point that I don't even think all of you fully appreciate is within your capacity. I don't have any. I became a lawyer and vice president because I wasn't competent enough to become a scientist. But all kidding aside, I find that there is, I didn't realize until, and this is not about my son, everybody in this room raise their hand if they had a loved one or someone close to them that's suffered from a cancer diagnosis. Raise your hand. You are representative of the world. We all know the most dreaded language a patient can hear is, you have cancer. It strikes more fear into the hearts of people than anything else that can be said to them, even diseases that are more certain to cause them to die. And one of the things that I found when my son was diagnosed with stage 4 glioblastoma, the brain, you all know there's less than a 1% shot of living. He knew it, we knew it. We had no illusions about it. We also know that, as my mother would say, as long as you're alive, you have an obligation to strive, and you're not dead until you've seen the face of God. And so we continued to hope that science would outrun his disease, like all of you do if you've lost someone to cancer. And one of the things that I found out, I say, and thanks to Henry and to you, Stephen, for your team's work to bring this event, these researchers from across all nations together to deal with this disease. One of the things I didn't realize, because I had the capacity as vice president to command an awful lot of resources. And one of the things I found is when you're president or vice president, there's very few people who don't return your phone call from anywhere. I mean that sincerely. And I took advantage of it because I wanted to learn as much as I could about, like all of you did, even if you were not specialists in the field, all you could possibly learn about the disease who someone who was your soul was suffering from. And I was amazed to find out a couple things. I was amazed to find out that we had reached an inflection point probably then, 2 years ago, 5 years before that, for the first time, where science and technology were actually beginning to harmonize in a way that had never occurred in cancer research before. All of a sudden, you brought immunotherapy out of the wilderness. It was a voodoo science the previous 30 to 40 years. All of a sudden, there were collaborations and disciplines from chemical engineers to biologists to immunotherapists to a whole virologist that hadn't been working together before. And I thought to myself that meant, well, there's some increased hope here. And so what happened was I tried to learn as much as I could, as quickly as I could. And one of the things that I learned was when Richard Nixon declared the war on cancer, you have to be 30 years old to be a United States Senator. I was elected when I was 29. I had to wait after I was elected to be eligible to be sworn in. And it was in 72 when he declared the war on cancer. I was elected in 1973, or sworn in 73. And he was earnest as he could have been. But he had no army to conduct that war. He had no technology available of any consequence. As one of my friends, I will not mention his name because I haven't gotten permission, one of the leaders in the world, every one of you know if I mention his name in your community. He said, Joe, 20 years from now, they're going to look back on us as having been barbaric the way we treat cancer. 3 methods in the last 100 years. Find the tumor or cancer, excise it, doing many times necessarily considerable damage to the rest of the body, excising it. Once you excise it, bombard it with radiation, killing an awful lot of very healthy parts of your body and damaging your immune system. And then high doses of poison in your system called chemotherapy. It's the only thing we know, only thing we have known. And it's been necessary. But he said when we look back on this, when our great-grandchildren look back and we wonder what we were doing, it's because we didn't have the tools. You didn't have the tools. There wasn't the accumulation of information. And so a model was set up by Richard Nixon, a model to deal with the crisis of the day. At that time, you all know better than I, people thought there was a single cancer that resided in a different part of the body, so breast cancer or colon cancer or prostate cancer or brain cancer. They were the cancers, not realizing that the same cancer genome may be in each of those places at the same time. But what happened was, at the time, the model was Jonas Salk in a laboratory finding a cure for polio. It was the single individual was going to find that key to what it was to cure this cancer. And the entire system in terms of allocating research grants to education was set up based on that model. And back then, hospitals didn't share a single bit of information. They didn't have the capacity to share. They didn't have the tools, didn't have the technology. But 47 years later, we're in a completely different world. After decades of funding and research, training of scientists, physicians, treating millions of patients, we now have an army. And we have powerful new technologies and tools. And so with the Cancer Moonshot, when I went out to announce with Barack in the Rose Garden that I wasn't going to be running for president, because during that period I had planned on running, but when my son was again diagnosed with a death sentence, he was a very, very brave young man, like many of your patients. He was a decorated war hero in Iraq. He was the most popular politician in my state. And everything with him was about duty, but he'd say, "Dad, look at me. Look at me. When they ask you about me, smile, Dad. Smile. I don't want anybody feeling sorry for me. I don't want anybody knowing. Promise me, Dad. They know I have cancer, but promise me." And so I couldn't tell people when I really knew much earlier after he's diagnosed that I wasn't going to run for president. I couldn't say that because everyone would have known the reason I wasn't running, because I had been planning to, was my son. When I finally made the decision after he passed away to make the formal announcement that I wasn't running, I walked out into the Rose Garden and I said, and it was spontaneous, I had no prepared text. I had a fair amount of support and I wanted to let people know why I wasn't. I owed it to them. And the president stood with me, and I said it was a throwaway line because I knew the press would ask me if I had any regrets. I said, I have one regret, that I would not be the president who gets to preside over the end of cancer as we know it over the next 8 years. Out of that, without telling me, Barack announced at the State of the Union that he was giving me control of the federal government. I mean, literally control, not semi, control of all the elements of the federal government that had anything to do with cancer and cancer research, and to coordinate with the private sector. And he called it the Moonshot. I almost wish he hadn't called it the Moonshot, because it was like, here we go again, and we're doing this all over again. And I learned early on, I traveled the world, literally the world, and I traveled all over the United States with every major cancer hospital in the United States. I went down to Brisbane to the new facility. I've been in almost every major cancer facility in the world. And my purpose was to find out what were the impediments that existed at the federal level in our organizing this effort, And what were the impediments that existed among all of you experts in terms of getting in the way of making more progress? And I found there emerged a consensus, usually private consensus, that people wouldn't say publicly, that there was very little collaboration, very little sharing of data, and we had powerful new tools. Our Department of Energy has developed a computing capacity of 1 billion calculations per second. Mark my words, I say it here, within 3 years it will be 1 billion calculations per second. An enormously powerful tool in your hands. You can aggregate data in the hundreds of thousands and millions. It would take 20 Nobel laureates 10 years to do what can be done in a matter of minutes in the next 10 years. And so one of the things that I laid out in the report, presumptuous of me to say this, some of you may have read the report that we finally issued after a year and a half, a little over a year and a half. I laid out 2 primary goals. First one was to inject the urgency of now into this fight. The urgency of now. To double the rate of progress in the next 5 years would otherwise take 10 years to do. And 2, which offended a lot of you in an editorial sense, is to change the culture. Change the culture. Come up with a new strategy for a new fight based on what we now know that you all have developed over the last 47 years. Not the last fight. When cancer research and care system was set up, as I said, there were no mechanisms to share, no capacity to share. And the model was viewed as totally different than it is today. And so in updating this strategy, we were able to put together at the NIH, in the Cancer Moonshot, 2 elements. One, all the elements of the government that could have any impact on the fight on cancer. And I remember the first meeting I called with NIH and the National Cancer Institute. I also included NASA. They know more about radiation than you will, they've forgotten more than you will know. They'd never been engaged. They'd never been involved. Decided to bring in the Department of Energy. They'd never been involved in the fight, never been engaged, and I could go on. And it met with initial resistance until everybody realized I had the power to fire people there. No, I'm not joking. Remember the one guy who said, I asked him how long it would take to put an assistant secretary in place for one particular cancer office? And it was March the 7th, I remember, and he said, by the end of the year. These guys, remember, I looked at my watch, I said, it's the 7th, it's 10 minutes of 10. If you don't have it done by April 1st, you're fired. Well, son of a gun. It was done by April the 1st. Because it's the urgency of now. The urgency of now. So we were overwhelmed by public interest in the Moonshot. The desire of people everywhere to be part of it. We had a Cancer Moonshot Summit at one of the local universities, Howard University in Washington. 400 people, providers as well as advocates, but the scientific community attending. We had over 7,000 people join in nearly 300 individual summits in every state in the nation, including Puerto Rico and Guam. In that moment, I believe the Moonshot evolved from a program to a movement. And the result of the movement is we've been able to identify and grow new approaches to data sharing, clinical trials, access to care, and prevention programs. Not because your collective professions do not care, but we're in a mindset of not using all the tools available. For example, as you know, in the United States of America, 4 out of 10 people diagnosed with cancer, 4 out of 100, qualify for becoming part of a trial. try going on and finding where the trial is if you're a brilliant oncologist in the Midwest, not near a great cancer hospital. You've diagnosed exactly right what it was. But try to find a trial. And I was told in Nashville, oh, we don't know how, we're not sure how to do this. So I went and got a group of brilliant young folks from Silicon Valley. I said, can you put together a website for me? In 6 weeks, did a website where you could speak plain English into it, describe your cancer, either your doctor or you, and find out every single trial that existed in the nation and the ones nearest to you. It was interesting. So the drug companies are currently testing, for example, hundreds of promising new early research drugs. Growing a number of them have targeted specific tumor genomic signatures. That's why through the Moonshot, the NCI, I complained about it, I raised it, but NCI came up with the answer. We set up a drug formulary. Drug formulary, each company puts their compound on the table. There's about 220, I think, roughly, is the number, on the table that they're trying to get FDA approval for. And we started with just a few, and now we have dozens of companies participating, where they allow any researcher in the world to come and use their drugs in multiple combinations, as was mentioned. HIV, AIDS. It wasn't a single drug. It was multiple drugs that put it in the place it is now. I know nothing about it, but you experts tell me there is real promise in the use of multiple drugs. So here's how it works. When you go into a bar here in Ireland and you want to play a tune in a jukebox or anywhere else where you live, you don't need a separate licensing agreement to play any of Bono's songs or Coldplay. It's already negotiated. Well, the formulary, NCI has already worked out the details of all the compounds, intellectual property, access, and licensing, a process that would otherwise take years for researchers to be able to get, because it would take somewhere between a year and 3 years for any one of you to try to get the compound from 3 different companies to be able to use them. I know nothing about cancer, but I know how to organize. So the Cancer Moonshot also initiated the blood profiling Atlas pilot, now being called BloodPack. Representatives from government and academia talked to me, pharmaceutical industry, diagnostic companies. They launched this partnership to open a database for liquid biopsy, blood draws, to accelerate the development of safe and effective ways to detect, track cancer development, treatment, and from signals in the blood. You all understand the science behind it. But up to this point, there wasn't any overwhelming international collaboration. The Cancer Moonshot didn't just make an impact in the United States. You and many of your colleagues across the world answered the Moonshot call to action. In April of 2016, I delivered remarks at a conference of regenerative medicine hosted by the Vatican that the Pope addressed as well. There I laid out the following guideposts that I thought international collaboration required to the Moonshot, because already every country, because most of my responsibility as a vice president was the president gave me authority on foreign policy because he couldn't meet with every world leader, so gave me sections of the world that everybody knew when I spoke, not about me. They knew I spoke for the president. There was no, as my mother would say, nothing missed between the lip and the cup. I was sitting with MBZ in Dubai on the Mediterranean talking about ISIS. He has his whole national security team with him, mine with me. And he starts off by saying, before we begin, can we talk about cancer, Mr. Vice President? Same in Jordan, same in Israel, same in Korea, same discussion in Japan. We brought together the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Group, 50 heads of state, into the White House in a yearly meeting, sat around a table that was rectangular tables put together. The room was about as big as this room, and there's a fireplace there and a major opening. You've seen it 1,000 times in CNN. the red carpet going into this magnificent room, the president sitting in the middle of the room in front of the fireplace, and me with my back across from him to that great hall. And he literally, not a joke, starts off and says to the 50 heads of state that were there, I know, quote, I know you all want to talk to Joe about cancer. Not a joke. But let's talk about nuclear nonproliferation first. Evidence of how this has begun to move, where people are beginning to think maybe hope in history, maybe, just maybe. And so, as I spoke to the Regenerative Medicine Conference sponsored at the Vatican with a number of the world leaders sitting there, I said the Moonshot is a focus on, first, prevention, access, affordability around the world, not just in the United States. Two, an international response to cancer should reflect the same urgency that we bring to dealing with infectious diseases. Cancer is a constant emergency, on the path to take more than 10 million lives a year. The United States, not the World Health Organization, organized the effort from the U.S. Army to deal with Ebola, to keep it from being a gigantic problem. We all necessarily focus on the potential for pandemics. We have a pandemic right now. It's called cancer. Thirdly, we have to support standardization of data and biorepositories. As a lawyer and as a vice president, I did it because I wasn't capable of doing anything else. I was amazed how little discipline you all have as a profession. Not a joke. Not a joke. If you want to talk about the genome, there's standard language. Standard. There is no standard way to communicate worldwide or even within the United States of America that exists now. Electronic record keeping, which we spent $30 billion, Barack and I, on, ended up producing 6 companies in 6 silos and $5 billion apiece. Doesn't communicate with one another. No way to transfer data. All of you tell me, in the editorial sense, that access to biopsy, lifestyles, genomes is important to be able to aggregate and determine, yet there's no standard procedure to how to deal with the biopsies that are laid on a table for 2 weeks and no longer are useful. Thirdly, was to increase government investment in cancer research and capitalize on this moment, this inflection point. And fourthly, one that you respond to in an overwhelming fashion, began increasing data sharing among researchers, institutions, foundations, and nations. And throughout 2016, we had interest from many countries around the world. And together we've made real progress. One, we launched the National Cancer Institute of Genomic Data Commons at the University of Chicago to bring together sequencing data and related patient information at the Cancer Genome Atlas. Well, that was 14,000 individuals, their data. Well, because of your commitment and of your institutions, that database continues to grow. It's now 30,000. There's no reason it shouldn't be 1 million. The United States has signed memorandums of understanding with Australia, Canada, China, Germany, Japan, Republic of Korea, Switzerland, the American Institute of Taiwan, to share proteogenomic data to advance research to find new answers for patients around the globe. The way I explain proteogenomics to people, and I'm no expert, but genes are like the total roster of football players on a team. There's 40 people. The proteins are the 11 American football players that go out on the field. People understand it. You don't have to talk down to people to make it clear with a consequence. These international agreements represented in this room add tens of thousands more patients, not only to Genomic Data Commons, but to these new Proteome Proteome, anyway, you get it, sharing commons that are and also imaging repositories. This is pretty remarkable. You know, I've spoken from the beginning of the Moonshot about the silos that existed between research and institutions. All these silos, because of you jumping on now, are beginning to tumble. We're beginning to show more collaboration. You're committed to getting the most scientific and specific picture of what's happening in cancer cells by looking not only at the gene, but the proteins that work in those cells. To date, 21 institutions spanning 11 countries have come together to share cancer-associated clinical research data, genetic and other molecular information, targeted tests, medical imaging for the use by cancer researchers and physicians around the world. That was all we'd be useful even 50 years ago, but to analyze it was virtually impossible. But like I said, can now do 1 billion calculations per second. What a wasting asset that sits out there for the research you are doing. And I hear as of today you've grown by an additional member. Korea University, the Republic of Korea, just officially approved become a member of the ICPC. The University College of Dublin has also committed to becoming a member of the ICPC and is going to do this, as I think, with the support of the Cancer Society here, further expanding Dublin's cutting-edge cancer research and the existing links around the world. And the important thing is that all this data contributed through these partnerships is available and accessible by any researcher anywhere in the world. What shocked me when I tried to learn more about this when the president gave me this authority was, you know, if you come to the United States, if you get a grant from NASA to study the seventh ring of Saturn, and you get a $50 million grant, by the time you finish that study, whether it's a success or failure, you must publish it for the whole world to see, even if it has national defense implications. But I found out the same situation lists for grants given by NIH for cancer research. Well, guess what? Close to 80% never publish. When you publish behind a $120,000 a year publication. And you don't publish failures. So one of the good things the president did with me was, because I'm a bad guy, I guess, is he gave me a lot of authority. So I put in place a provision that said that for every day after you finish your study, if you don't publish it, you will be personally fined $10,000 a day. Well, guess what, everybody, as they say in the southern part of my country, where they talk at you like this, you know what I mean? All of a sudden, the boy saw Jesus. An epiphany, as we Catholics say, there was an epiphany. An epiphany. Because failure can be as important to you in deciding what's working and not as success. In addition to the data sharing collaborations we announced as part of the Moonshot, 3 new MOUs with Japan, Serbia, and Sweden, focused on advancing cancer research and care through greater collaboration. The National Cancer Institute, partnering with those countries and recommended areas and topics of joint workshops, development collaboration, research projects, facilitate an expedited review and clearance of collaborative proposals. And they foster joint activities to advance more research. Thirdly, we created a network of regional centers of research excellence that are going to support partnerships with low and middle income countries to establish regional hubs to coordinate basic, transitional, clinical, and population science research relevant to that region. The first set of 6 regional centers and research excellence will there's a large population-based breast cancer cohort in Vietnam that's being set up. 2, we're strengthening the management of data of breast cancer and hypertension in Botswana and South Africa. 3, we created a regional resource for cancer pathology and trauma surgery in Malawi. We developed infrastructure to examine cancer and diabetes in Colombia, Costa Rica, Guatemala, and Mexico. These are all being set up now. And we're building a pathology-based cancer registry to study breast and uterine and cervical cancers in Bangladesh. We established a countrywide clinic-based method to prevent and control breast and oral cancers in India. And finally, the U.S. Department of State has agreed to heighten and identify, if it ever, I shouldn't get into politics. Anyway. To identify potential opportunities in creating cooperation, because there are over 70 bilateral science and technology engagements and agreements the State Department already has. We've got to let the Secretary of State know that. Because of your commitment to collaboration, there's a renewed momentum, and with that, a renewed hope. But on all these fronts, you know better than I do. We're just getting started. We're just getting started. You've made significant progress on building on the work of many who have been at this for decades. But we're far from winning the battle. We started as an office in the White House, the Cancer Moonshot, and it became a call to action for our nation, for our country. And the American public has responded overwhelmingly. But it's also become a movement not only across the United States, but around the world. There's an incredible amount of momentum. And with your help, we can build on it. So in June, with the input from and at the urging of several dozen experts, including Eric Lander at MIT, Elizabeth Jaffe at Johns Hopkins, several experts that my first conversation at Davos, Nobel laureate and president of Salk Institute, Elizabeth Blackburn, and two other Nobel laureates, David Agus from the University of Southern California, and every major cancer institute in the country. When the next administration did not pick up the Moonshot, they asked me whether or not could they start an organization called the Biden Cancer Initiative, focused on basically the same principles, changing the way we do business in research and development, and in providing cancer care by breaking down silos and increasing collaboration. We're going to raise and have staff about $30 to $50 million, but it's not to give research grants. It's to continue to make public in all your countries, as well as ours, the nature of the work that's going on. And one of the things I found is that I have no talent in terms of expertise in this. But there's two things I'm good at. I can convene, and people tend to show up. No, I'm not being facetious. And two, I can shame. Not a joke. Not a joke. For example, I was the keynote speaker at Davos on the fourth industrial revolution, but when I got named to run the Cancer Moonshot, Klaus asked me whether I'd do a roundtable, and I put together Blackburn, a lot of those people I just mentioned, including 3 Nobel laureates. There are 88 heads of state there, 2,800 CEOs. In the room were probably 12 to 15 heads of state, and somewhere around 300 CEOs. We put on this roundtable. And part of it, to give you an illustration, was there were 4 really brilliant, notable people who, out of the 12 in the roundtable, were setting up each spending roughly, you may remember this, each spending roughly $250 million to set up repositories to be able to aggregate all this data. And all 4 spoke, and they're all doing the same thing. So I asked them to come would they meet with me back in Washington privately. I didn't even have the staff with me, and I'll not name them now either. And they sat with me in this conference room of the Vice President's office, and they sat there, and they each laid out what their plan was. And after about 30 minutes of them talking, I looked across and I said, well, it seems to me You're all doing the exact same thing. And here was the body language. I'm not exaggerating. My word is abiding. So I asked for a coffee break. Just me and these 4 people. Spending $1 billion to do the exact same thing. On the grounds of selling me that the more data you can aggregate, the more potential breakthrough is there. And they saddle up to me one at a time, drinking coffee, and say, look, Mr. Vice President, please keep this going. Keep the pressure on. Because if I am, I'm going to keep the pressure on. Well, the good news is not because of me. 2 of them are now doing it together, and the possibility all 4 shortly. I spoke to the organization, what's it called? The research organization. At home, there's about 12. AACR. The first year I spoke 2 years ago, I was making a similar case about the need to share data. I was labeled by the New England Medical Journal editor as promoting data parasites. But these are 9,000 young researchers, not all young, but researchers in New Orleans. And as I spoke, they were in clusters standing up and cheering. The leadership sat in the front row like, this year, I got introduced, you were there, as if I was the second coming. Am I joking? Biden has done more for, well, it's, Biden hasn't done a thing except try to ask questions after listening a long time as to what the impediments you're facing are. Ask questions, well, would this work? Would that work? Would it help you accommodate? Give you the last example. You can have your cancer genome sequenced for about $1,000 now instead of 200 and some thousand some time ago. We have the largest hospital in the world in the United States, the VA hospital. A lot of vets coming home. And by the way, one of the things, if you read Burn Pits, without my knowing, did an entire chapter on my son, because we would burn all this toxic material in large numbers, and we have more young men coming home and women from serving in Iraq and Afghanistan with brain cancer than we've ever had. Which I haven't even talked about the environment. I'm not going to do that with you now. I haven't even talked about the prevention capabilities that exist out there. But think about it. At the very time we're walking away from climate change and the environment and lessening regulations on the environment, tell me that doesn't have a lot to do with the cancer incidences around the world? I mean, what are we doing? But that's a different subject. Back to this initiative. So the Biden Cancer Initiative is not my idea. It's the idea of 4 Nobel laureates and the heads of 17 major cancer centers in the United States. And they went out and hired McKinsey and Company to put together this organizational structure to try to maintain what I'm begging you to do, the urgency of now, and a continued change in the culture. Like I said, I've never met more dedicated, I'm not being solicitous, dedicated, honorable, brilliant people than all of you. I really haven't anywhere in the world. But the culture has to continue to change. Those of you who are clinicians, and I've spoken too long, I have another bunch of the speech that's not worth boring you with. But one of the things that I think clinicians understand better than researchers, they're no better or worse, but what they understand better is the urgency of now. Those of you who are clinicians, or those of you who have had someone you love and adore dying of cancer. How many times have you heard, Doc, can you give me just 4 more weeks? I know I'm not going to live, so I can see my son graduate. Doc, she's my firstborn. Sorry. She's my firstborn. She's about to have my first grandchild. Let me live just long enough to hold her. Just let me live long enough. They're not asking to be saved. 50% of your patients who end up dying, they're not asking you to save them. They're asking you, give me just a little more time. Just a little more time. We can do that right now if we collaborate more. Without one single solitary new breakthrough. We can do that now. I got a call and I'm with this from the chairman of IBM. We've been working very hard with NIH, have done an incredible job working with the Department of Energy and working with the Veterans Administration. Every single vet coming back or not coming back diagnosed with cancer, it gets their genome sequenced quickly and really well. So you know what I got from the chairman of the board of IBM? Mr. Vice President, would you like Watson, the supercomputer? Watson has read every single solitary thing that has ever been written about cancer. The genome comes back, it drops in one of those 204 categories of cancer, and immediately pops up within a matter of less than an hour every single therapy that has ever been used on that particular kind of cancer. And you know as well as I do, starting off with the cancer therapy that has the best chance fundamentally increases the prospect of longevity. By the time my son, again, not about my son, it happens to others, at the very end they decided to use anti-PD-1 and inject an adenovirus into his brain. But because of the radiation and because of the chemo, which was rational to do, his immune system was damaged, fundamentally compromised. So its prospect of working was de minimis. The docs were giddy at first with the prospect that it was just eating away at the tumor. But it never stopped. You all know the most promising therapy used first increases the prospects, at least of extension. So guys, ladies, you're a remarkable asset to every one of your countries. I mean, you really are. You are an enormous asset. But this knows no boundaries. This knows no boundaries. So I beg you, continue to work together. Increase that collaboration. And if my mom, Catherine Eugenia Finnegan, were here, she'd look at y'all and say, you're all doing God's work, and thank you for doing it.